Before discussing the topic of Chapter 5, it's a good idea to review some common terms that do maybe differ between academic use and common everyday use. We often have used the terms nation and country in the similar way that the academic language actually refers to a state, which is a geographically bounded territory over which there is one authority that contains the monopoly of the use of violence in that territory. So this is somewhat different than how the academic language refers to a nation, which is a cultural term and refers to people who share common identity and language and practices and a common heritage. So a nation can oftentimes relate to a specific ethnicity, but oftentimes relates to a cultural group of people who do not have a state that is all of their own. Think of the Palestinians, for example, Jewish people. They do have the state of Israel, but they are not merely contained in that state. You also have Native Americans in the United States who did not have their own geographically bounded territory, but do have distinct identities as people. And in the rare events where you find a nation complete and the only nation occupying a territory that is a state, you have a nation state. So understand that a lot of times when the word state is being referenced, we're not talking about our local constituent units in the United States. We're talking about entire countries. And again, as we learned in the previous chapter, the forces of colonization and after World War I and World War II decolonization have greatly shaped the way that states exist in the world. And finally, an important distinction that matters for what we'll be talking about today in governments is whether or not a state has its power concentrated in a unitary government or exists as a federal government. A unitary government means that there is one strong central government and the laws tend to be uniform throughout that country. In the case of a federal government, there is a central government, but the constituent units, in our case in the United States, the states, also have their own rulemaking and governing power. So the degree of autonomy that is contained outside of the central government is what we're referring to with unitary and federal governments. But some unitary governments will from time to time devolve certain powers to their constituent units, whether that's provinces or counties or states, as it is in our country. But that devolution in the case of a unitary government can always be reversed, meaning that they can always take back that power. So now we move on to a discussion of governments. And a simple definition of government is the organization of political power and authority within a state. So all governments have a basis of authority, but that authority might come from different sources. So there are three major sources for authority that we find in states. The first is traditional. The justification for someone's authority might rest in religious rights or religious scripture, but it also might lie in hereditary means of authority. Charismatic authority, I think that sort of speaks for itself, but sometimes a strong personality manages to convince people of the need for their authority, and you have many instances of this throughout history. This is the Filipino president Duterte, who sort of embodies charismatic leadership today. And then finally you have rational legal, which we most often associate with codified legal forms of government, and usually democracy. There are three major ways that a government might maintain its authority and its power. They may do this through a combination of effectiveness, force, or legitimacy. And there are certain trade offs, obviously, between a couple of these. So the overuse of force might actually mean a trade off or a lowering of legitimacy. And also, it could impact a government's effectiveness. And when we talk about effectiveness, we just mean, do government programs work? Do they provide people with what they say they're going to do? Does the government make good use of its money and its salaries? One of the things we actually study a lot when we look at different types of governments are kind of trends in types of governments that are adopted by states. And over time, we have noticed that more and more governments have sort of moved to a democratic form of government. There are a lot of reasons behind this, including just the fact that states, because they do business with each other, influence each other. Oftentimes on purpose. And we observe three major waves of democratization that occur, really starting with obviously the United States and Western Europe, and then moving into post-World War II, Latin America and Africa, and perhaps even the Middle East and Southeast Asia today. Well, to be more precise, not today, but in the new millennium, there is actually some talk of a receding wave in democracies taking place today, which is also represented in the graph. So like everything else, we have a definition, and for democracy, we tend to think of consisting of the rule of law, constitutions, and electoral representation. This goes back really to the theories of John Locke, who talked about representativeness in the government as an important basis for the government's legitimacy. And so instead of direct democracy, where individuals vote on laws with every individual law, they send representatives to do that work for them. There are two major data sets that actually look at rankings of democracy and scorings of democracy. These are Polity4 and Freedom House. I encourage you to look up these in any country you're interested in these databases, and look at how they have evaluated the democracies. And essentially, this is work that's done by dozens of scholars every year, and they take tons of qualitative and quantitative information on states and use a scoring system to assign them a democracy score. And this map, actually two maps that I have put in this slide, really kind of color-coded their different scores around the world. Just a side note, the ancient Greek definition of democracy was rule by the people, quite literally. And this table in your book gives us a sample of countries and the different scores that they're assigned through Freedom House and Polity4. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, accepting all others. That is Churchill. So we begin with a discussion of democracy by acknowledging that it is an imperfect form of government, just like all other forms. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, we've really seen the definition of democracy expanded into one we would consider liberal democracy, meaning one that attempts to expand liberties to more of the population. And an important part of this is that it's more important that you have minority rights, that you go beyond just simple elections, that you protect civil liberties in a liberal democracy. So there are higher standards that are attached to this type of democracy than just an electoral democracy. For one thing, the mere presence of elections is not enough. There has to be an allowance for real competition, and there has to be the free participation of citizens, so they can't be prohibited from voting or blocked from voting with unnecessary obstacles. And the rights of minorities, like people who have mental disorders, people who have who practice a minority religion, women. In the past, there were people who were made, African Americans were made into slaves. These are the types of minority rights that liberal democracy is seen as needing to uphold. And a lot of this obviously has been brought about through movements like the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement that brought our attention to the fact that, well, we have elections, but we don't necessarily have the free and fair participation of all of our citizens. So again, this is just extending that definition of democracy. I mentioned before that the rational legal basis of authority is one that is most associated with democracy, but democracies don't just rely on rational legal basis of authority. They also rely on traditional bases of authority. I've got pictures here of various royalty in Europe, and European countries all have constitutional democracies. They all believe and have enshrined liberal democracy into their legal codes. So they also rely, though, on these figureheads, these sort of traditional bases of authority, the monarchy. In places like the United States, you also see a reliance on some of these traditional bases of authority when you have flags and parades and our anthems, the things that sort of support this traditional idea of the United States. Another way that democracies keep themselves in power is through being effective. Being able to be voted out of office tends to be a fairly big motivator to do your job well, at least ideally. And this tends to make democracies more effective at actually, completing their tasks of keeping roads paved, bridges built, and trains running on time, so to speak. So this is an important feature of democracies as well. We also look at what are called illiberal democracies as a little bit of a controversial topic. In some circles within political science, these countries would just be referred to as authoritarian governments, and we'll talk about those forms in just a moment. But the distinguishing factor in illiberal democracies is that they have elections. These countries generally very tightly control who gets to run in elections, whether that is excluding certain political parties from participating or just opposition to the party in power, keeping those at bay. They're often termed managed democracies, where instead of allowing people to have all of the civil liberties that we are used to seeing in liberal democracies, some of those are controlled. Freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, these things might be tightly overseen by the government, but they still allow for elections. And so there is kind of the hint of legitimacy through the fact that people seem to be sanctioning the government by showing up time and again. The problem is the fact that the elections don't actually make much difference is indicative of it not being democratic. The best example that we have of an illiberal democracy really is Russia, where they have a constitution, they have the rule of law, and they have regular elections. But anybody who really opposes the party that Putin is in, the Unity Party, is never really allowed much of a chance to participate in the elections. Either they're ruled illegitimate for some technicality, or they're actually put in prison for criticizing the government or for some made-up charge. I do encourage you to watch this video. It's kind of old and dated, but still very funny. I provided that link for that purpose. The major distinguishing factor between authoritarian governments and illiberal democracies really is that in an authoritarian government, there really is no legitimate connection back to voters or the citizenry. They don't even have the sort of semblance of democracy in the form of elections. A few types of authoritarianism worth note. Totalitarian governments are extreme forms of authoritarian government that control all aspects of citizens' lives. Some things you may not have heard before related to authoritarian governments include theocracy, maybe, I'm not sure, but this is where religious figures are in control of the government. A kleptocracy really would be where the person in control has done so just to enrich themselves.